So basically, we have covered the extent to all of the rhythm that we will get to in this class. We will continue to look at rhythm throughout, of course, because rhythm is a factor in every piece of music that we'll be looking at. But from here on out, we're going to be talking about ways to organize pitch. So this week is going to be all about organizing pitch in terms of like looking at what it is on the page, listening to pitch, looking at pitch on a keyboard. This week and next week, we'll talk about scales, which are the horizontal organization of pitch. And then the end of the class will involve looking at chords, which is the vertical organization of pitch. So from here to the end of the class is essentially just different things we can do with pitch. So if you're still a little bit struggling with some of the rhythm stuff, we'll have some more practice on that as we go throughout. But we basically will spend the rest of the time now practicing what we've been doing for rhythm. So let's talk about what exactly pitch is. I'm going to start off and get a little nitpicky just for the sake of keeping us all on the same page. When we talk about pitch in music, we're talking about just a vertical orientation. So if you think of, rhythm in time as being kind of a horizontal component that happens from one point to another, pitch is merely just the vertical aspect of that. So if rhythm is music horizontally, then pitch is music vertically. We measure music in pitch from a more acoustic perspective in frequency. So the higher the frequency, the higher the pitch. So if you have a lower frequency, you have a lower pitch, a higher frequency, a higher pitch. This is not going to get into technical terms in terms of how frequency and pitch are related super much. But for those of you who are familiar with frequency and familiar with properties of acoustics, pitch is basically just a higher or lower frequency. And we assign particular letter names to represent different frequencies. So in Western music, we've essentially just collectively decided, there's a lot of wiggle room in this statement, but we've just collectively decided what pitches we're going to use and what pitches get letter names. So we're basically just taking a numerical number, for instance, 440 hertz, and just designating that is what we would call the pitch A. So that's all that we're really talking about. Pitch is a much more fluid and kind of dynamic thing beyond thinking about a keyboard or thinking about a staff. But for our purposes, we're going to limit ourselves to what in Western music we look at on a staff and how we tune pianos to these particular frequencies, to these pitches. So we use letter names to represent these different pitches. So let's talk a little bit about that. So while technically any frequency could be a pitch, in Western music, we've decided on certain pitches that we use regularly. And, if you've ever been to an orchestra concert or have ever just heard musicians tuning up, they're basically aligning all of their instruments to a set frequency. So that way all of their pitches relative to that will be the same. So these pitches have specific names, and we use letter names for this, but not every letter name. We use specifically A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. These repeat. So if we were to ascend pitches A, B, C, D, E, F, G, once we go above G, we're back to A again. And then it just repeats over and over again, top to bottom. There is technically speaking no lowest pitch and technically speaking no highest pitch. The lowest pitch on the keyboard is oftentimes an A, which is convenient for us. But this is kind of a flexible system that gets repeated throughout. And we'll talk about the piano later and kind of how that factors in. So these are the letter names that we use. After G, we repeat to A, and all the frequencies of A sound the same. So for instance, once we go from this A and then get to G and then go to another A, those two A's will sound the same. They'll just be, one will be lower, one will be higher, but to our ear, they will sound as if they're the same. We'll talk about this property later, but that's kind of a fundamental thing for us, is that once we cycle through these letters, basically the same pitch in different registers, or what we call different octaves, they sound the same, just at different heights or depths. So if you don't know exactly what I mean, we'll be talking about this a lot this week. So this will make a lot more sense as we proceed. But that's why we kind of limit to these letters, because once we get past G, there's nothing else we need. We can just go straight to A again. So let's talk about the keyboard a bit. So some of you I know are keyboardists, some of you aren't keyboardists. This is not a class about playing the keyboard. This is more using the visual space of a keyboard as a reference for thinking about pitch. So one way we can think about pitches being represented is, of course, the keyboard. So we have low on the left to high on the right. So the lower on the left you go, the lower the pitch gets, and the higher on the right you go, the higher the pitch. The white keys focus just on the bottom for now. The white keys correspond to these 7 letters. So for instance, this key is always A. This key is always B. This key is always C. Now, this is fixed. As you can see, the A between these two is the same here as it is over here. You may be going, how the heck am I going to memorize all of that so quickly? So basically, in terms of knowing what to label our white notes, we can use our black notes, our black keys, to kind of orient us. So notice that on a keyboard, you've got this 2 plus 3 pattern. There's not a black key between every white key. There are certain places where that doesn't happen. So we've got 2 black keys, 3 black keys, 2 black keys, 3 black keys. So if you have never looked at a piano before and have never had to point out a note on a piano, I'm sure that you've all seen a piano, but it's unlikely that all of you have played a piano before. Use this 2 and this 3 to memorize where C and F are. C is below the 2 black keys, and F is below the 3 black keys. From there, from those 2 anchor areas, you can then go, okay, if I go down from C, I go to B. If I go up from C, I go to D, and so on. So that was extremely quick. We will continue to look at pitches on the keyboard throughout the rest of the day, but that is basically the gist of the white keys. So there is a certain aspect of this just needs to be kind of memorized, but you can use the 2 plus the 3 to keep that in mind for you. So any questions about how we label our keys here? Like I said, it is consistent, it does repeat. So every C is going to be in the same place, whether it's here or here or here. They're all going to be C's. Same with A's, same with F's, same with everything. It just repeats over and over and over again. Okay, let's go ahead and continue looking at this a little bit more. But wait, if these are just our letters for the white keys, then what the heck are the black keys? Like, what do we call the black keys? Because if we go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, well, what do we do for those in-between notes? Why isn't B this black key? Well, there's a couple reasons for that. And let's go ahead and talk about the black keys a little bit. In order to get into this, we have to talk about something called half steps and whole steps. Put very simply, half steps and whole steps are simply just, a way to describe the distance between 2 notes. And the black keys are named in relationship to the white keys. So in essence, every black key can be thought of as raising one white key or lowering another. So before naming the black keys, we have to talk about raising or lowering pitches. And we do that through half steps and whole steps. Moving from one note on the keyboard to the adjacent note is called a half step. So if you're moving from one white key up to the adjacent black key, that is a half step. Moving from one note through 2 adjacent notes is called a whole step. The reasons why this is half and this is whole instead of single and double or something is historical, and we don't need to get into. So for right now, moving from one note to the adjacent pitch is a half step, and one pitch to the second adjacent pitch is a whole step. But wait, how does that factor in on the keyboard? What the heck am I talking about? Let's take a look at the keyboard here. So here's our keyboard. Now, I'll talk through these and then we'll have some practice identifying on our own later. So these 2 notes, for instance, we start, say, on this white note, and then we ascend to the next adjacent note, which happens to be another white note. This is a half step. These 2 notes here are a half step. And half steps don't depend on whether you're going up or down. It's still a half step if you're going down as if you're going up. It's regardless of direction. Conversely, here we have a white key. To the next adjacent note is a black key. That is also a half step. If we started on the black key and descended to a white key, that's still a half step. It's all half steps. Here, if we go from this white key to this white key, or D up to E, notice that there is a black key in the middle. So we've gone from one note through an adjacent note and then to a second note. This is a whole step. It's basically moving through 2 half steps, make a whole step. Same thing happens here. We start on one black key. The next adjacent note is a white key. We go to the next adjacent note after that, 2 adjacent notes. That is a whole step. Okay. Finally, this is where things get a little bit complicated, is because of the ways that our keyboard is configured. If we start on this black key and we go up a half step, we'd be on a white key. Up another half step to make a whole step is still a white key. So this is also a whole step, even though it looks visually like it shouldn't be. So you got to be careful with E and F and B and C. Okay, you got to be careful. So to summarize, these on the left are half steps and these are whole steps. So hopefully you can visually see the difference. These are immediately adjacent. These are near adjacent. They're close to each other, but they're not exactly right next to each other. Okay, we go through 2 half steps to get whole steps there. So once again, any questions on this concept? I'm going to highlight this concept. Oh, sorry. I'm going to highlight this concept really quick because this is kind of a segue to talk about the black keys, but half steps and whole steps actually get really important for us tomorrow. So making sure that we can think of half steps and whole steps on the keyboard is going to be really important for us. Okay, so let's go back to the keyboard now. So now we can think of the black keys as raising or lowering the white keys. We know this. Each black key, therefore, has 2 names. We can think of this pitch here, this black note, as either raising D or lowering E, because it is in between those 2. So we can think of this as either raising or lowering. And because of that, we have different symbols to represent this pitch here. In order to write this note, we can think of what's called accidentals. So we can think of adding something to a D to show that it's been raised, or adding something to an E to show that it's been lowered to whatever this is. Okay, let's talk about accidentals now. And again, this is going to be a little bit terminology heavy. So this is going to be a little bit of a, but bear with me and then we'll get some more practice later on this week with this stuff. So accidentals. And there's a keyboard free reference at the top. Accidentals are a name we have for symbols that indicate whether a note has been raised or lowered from its white key A to G starting place. So accidentals are always in reference to one of our letters from A to G. This is just going to involve some memory and repetition. This little symbol that looks kind of like a weird cursive B, we call a flat. Shows that a note has been lowered 1/2 step, okay? It's flat. Think of like, think of taking a rock and grinding it down to powder to, lower its height, making it flat. For example, if we see A with flat next to it, this is the pitch that you get on the keyboard from lowering A 1/2 step. So the middle black key here of these 3 black keys could be called A flat. We have lowered A 1/2 step. Sharp, which is a pound sign, a hashtag, whatever you want to call it. Sharp shows that a note has been raised 1/2 step. It's the opposite of a flat. A flat lowers, sharp raises. So instead, thinking of our rock again, if our rock is the stable note, if we ground it to dust to lower it, we can sharpen it, point it upwards to make it higher. That is a sharp. So for instance, A sharp is the pitch you get from raising A 1/2 step. So if we start on A again, which is right here, up 1/2 step is this note here. That's an A sharp, for instance. This symbol, which looks, I don't really know what it looks like to me. At this point, it just looks like a natural symbol to me. It kind of looks kind of like a boxy B. This is just an accidental that neutralizes something previous. So if you see A with the natural symbol here, that undoes a previous accidental. This confirms definitively that the A we're working with is a white key. So if you ever see the natural symbol, natural symbols are just a way to confirm that what we're dealing with is a white key, whereas sharps and flats are typically, but not always, typically black keys. So as a fun fact, other versions of this class have talked about what's called double sharps and double flats. We're not going to. I don't really want to spend the time on it, but just so you know, they do exist. We may see them in some examples here and there. They're relatively rare, but basically you may be going, well, hold on a sec, flats and sharps only raises up 1/2 step. So double sharps and double flats raises up whole steps. The symbol for double sharp is a little bold X, and the symbol for double flat is just 2 flat symbols. The reasons why we would use these, we can't really get into right now because we need to talk about scales and things like that first. So we're not going to worry about that. But just so you know that these are hypothetical things that we may see throughout this class. The big important ones are flats, sharps, and naturals. So make sure to commit to memory what each of these symbols mean and and what they do, like what they do to a pitch. So any questions before you move on? Flats, sharps, accidentals. Okay. Accidentals on a keyboard. So now let's take a look at our keyboard and look at our black keys again in context. So if this is C, if we were to raise C, that would make it C sharp. So this black key, one of its names could be C sharp. Conversely, if we were to lower D, D down there would be D flat, and so on. All these black keys have two names. If we raise G, or pardon me, if we lower G, G down a half step gives us G flat. So you can see that there. These are moving by half steps. Now, to illustrate that each note has a double name, if we raise A or lower B, this same key on the keyboard could be thought of as A sharp or B flat. For right now, we don't need to worry about why you would do one or the other. The context actually really does matter, especially once we get into material tomorrow. So the difference is important, but for right now, we'll just treat them as being the same. It's not a huge deal for us. E up a half step. This is where things get tricky because you may see this in the wild. E up a half step would normally be F. But if you see E sharp is E up a half step. E sharp and F are the same. So the spots where you've got B to C or E to F get really tricky because the accidentals can kind of break our expectations of what accidentals should be. A B sharp, for instance, is the same as a C. A C flat, for instance, is the same as a B. So whenever you see a note that's got B, E, C, or F, just go alert in your head until we get some more practice with this, because depending on the situation, you may want to write E sharp and not write F. Because, again, we'll talk about this later on this week. But just so you know, that is something that can happen. I will say that the lion's share, the majority of the times that you see accidentals will be in situations like this, where it's just describing the black key. So it's not always this complicated, but it does sometimes get that complicated. Okay, questions now, other questions. Again, a lot of content today. And this is going to be the kind of thing where we may not spend a whole ton of time in class today, but this is something that will be useful to practice. So keep that in mind. Okay, speaking of practice, let's do some pitch identification on the keyboard. So let's do these left to right. I'll give you 15 seconds. We'll proceed at the left to right orange arrows in succession. So remember, C is below the 2 and F is below the 3, right? And then remember how we use our accidentals. So for all the black keys here, there will be 3 potential names, or pardon me, 2 potential names for each of these 3 black keys. So first up, we have this pitch right here. So take 10 seconds. What is this pitch? And then go ahead and type it in the chat. Okay, it is in fact a D. So if this pitch here is C, the next letter in the alphabet is D. Therefore, this pitch is a D. There's no accidentals. It's not a black key. It's a D. So this pitch, and hold off on the chat. We'll give this one a good 10 seconds, and then we'll release the swarm, so to speak. Take a look at this pitch. This pitch has 2 potential right answers. And if you're going to type flats in chat, you can just type Bs, like just a lowercase b is fine. Take 10 seconds. What is this pitch right here? Okay, yeah, let's see it in the chat. Okay, I see a couple people coming in. Very nice, very nice. Yes, there's 2 right answers, F sharp or G flat. At this stage, doesn't matter which, that's totally fine. This is F. If we raise F, we get an F sharp. The next letter after the alphabet, after F is G. If we lower G, we get G flat. Okay, great. Next up, 10 seconds. What is this one right here? This third, oh, I should be revealing these. Sorry about that. What is this one right here? What is this pitch with this arrow? 10 seconds. Okay, okay. I see lots of A's in the chat. It is in fact an A. So I don't usually recommend memorizing where A is as a reference, because even though A begins the alphabet, as you can see, A is in kind of a weird location. So you can think of working backwards in the alphabet from C. So C, B, A. Or you could think of where F is. F goes to G, which is the end, and then we reset to A again. So you can think of it in terms of either of those places, perhaps. Okay, great. Next up, what is this right here? I just kind of gave it away, so just blow it in the chat. C, 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 C. It is in fact a C, yes. Or B sharp, yes, great, great. How cheeky, yes. It is also, could be considered a B sharp in the right circumstances. So that's right. For our purposes, we'll think of this as C. Okay, now this key right here has two names. I will take either name. Great, 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 great. Yes, it is in fact just a half step above this. So we can think of it as C sharp, or if we're thinking of lowering D, it could be D flat. Okay, let's look at this pitch. So the more that we look at the keyboard, for those of you who may still be taking a little bit extra time to get this than everyone may be taking, the more we look at the keyboard, the more these things will visually stick out to us. For instance, if we look at this, we know that this is A from what we just did. And if you look, the A's are in the same place. So down a half step from A is A flat. So we can think of it that way. That's kind of a quicker way, being able to kind of pinpoint certain pitches, regardless of where they fall on the keyboard, can really help to make this a faster process until eventually it'll just come through. So that is in fact G sharp or A flat. What about this one right here? What is this? Okay, okay. Yeah, this is in fact a B. So it is a B. We are a half step lower than a C, but also, as I think Kevin or somebody put it, yeah, you could also think of this as a C flat. If we add a flat to a C, that gives us a C flat. Okay, but we'll just call it B for right now. Keep our white notes simple. Okay, and then I've got one more. What is this one right here? Yeah, so we already looked at F sharp. So if we think of going a half step down from F sharp, we get F. Now, again, I will reiterate, if we're not still getting this that quickly, the saving grace is you may have noticed there's only 12 options total. We have our 7 white notes, and then we repeat them, and then we have 5 black notes, and then we repeat them. So that's a total of 7. And in this exercise, we went through 8 of them. So we've basically covered 3/4 of all of the possibilities just in this exercise. So the more that we do this, the easier this will get. So, okay, great. Nice work, everybody. Let's go ahead now and first reiterate why we're using the keyboard in the first place, because some of you may be wondering, what the heck are we doing with the keyboard if we can't play the keyboard? The piano keyboard provides us a way to represent music visually. So this is useful for us today and will be especially useful to us in later, like throughout the rest of the class. Thinking of the piano for a lot of people who are visual learners, it's a really easy way to think of it, because on a score, things are represented in a way that's more abstracted, whereas on a keyboard, it's very tangible, it's very physical. So as we continue later on to talk about other concepts like scales or intervals, the keyboard serves as a useful way to visualize space. Okay, it's basically just like a visual mnemonic. The keyboard was designed around our musical systems. So we can go in reverse and use the keyboard to help us reinforce musical systems. All of that said, we've looked at the keyboard a lot now, but how do we look at pitch on a staff? So remember, the staff is those horizontal lines that we looked at last week with rhythm. Last week, we only focused on rhythmic components, so removing pitch. Let's add the pitch back in now. We use what's called clefs. What a clef does is a clef is a symbol that tells us where pitches fall on a staff. Different clefs tell us where different pitches are. So last week we saw those two parallel bars a lot. What that clef was just telling us its rhythm. So we're going to look at two different clefs that are very visually iconographic that you may have seen in many places. There's two clefs that we're going to be using primarily. The treble clef, or the G clef, and then another clef called the bass clef. So this is called the treble clef. The treble clef is not a note. The treble clef is kind of it's like a password to where the notes are. So it looks like a kind of a distorted cursive G. So if you kind of see like the G shape there, that's where it comes from, because it is in fact called the G clef. It's called the G clef because the line through the little swirly there, see how the kind of the curve wraps around one line? That pitch is G. So the G clef shows us visually where G is, right? Having this as a reference allows us to find every other pitch. If we were to go up to the next adjacent space, we'd get an A. Up to the line, we get B, C, D, E, F, and then G sits right on top there. So accidentals are accidentals. We'll talk about them later. Basically, alternating lines and spaces give us white keys. So if we're on G here, the next space up would be the next note, which is A. If we go down, the space below is F. The line below is E, and so on. Okay. Now, this is one of our two clefs. There's two of them. The other one, of course, is the bass clef. We call it the bass clef because it usually signifies low music. But in addition, it's called the F clef. So it looks kind of like a backwards C, but if you use your imagination, it looks kind of like a fancy swirly F, where the line between the colon here is like the top of the F, right? Think of an F like that. The colon, notice the colon here, the two dots. The two dots surround a line. That line is F. So this is F. That's why it's called the F clef sometimes. So G clef, F clef. So they give us different information. If this is F, if we go up to the adjacent space, we would get G. The G in bass clef is going to be in different places than the G in treble clef, for instance. So these are completely different systems. You have to be kind of aware of where pitches fall in relation to different areas. We often call, when students will flub where a note is, we'll sometimes call it clef confusion. So for instance, if you were to mark this a D, looking at this, it's because you're thinking in treble clef. If you were to mark this a B, you'd be thinking in bass clef, for instance. So yeah, take it slow, and we're going to continue to just plow through a lot more stuff today. But when looking at pitches, take it slow. And especially at the beginning, an exercise that we'll have all of you do is writing out the pitches after just puzzling through and counting with the pencil or a mouse on a piece of paper, essentially. So questions on clefs before we continue, because the rest of today is going to be talking about pitches in relationship to clefs. Let's see, I have something in the chat. Yeah, so somebody asked me about viola. So violists, which for those of you who know is an instrument in size between a violin and a cello. It's like a bigger violin or a smaller cello, essentially. Violists specifically use a different clef, a third option. We will not be talking about alto clef. That's what that's called. It's called alto clef, just because it's not used as commonly outside of viola music and out of certain other instruments. And I think two clefs is more than enough for us to handle, but that's a good question. And if you ever want to look at more alto clef stuff, just let me know in office hours or shoot me an email. So yeah, we'll be primarily using these two. The reason why we primarily use these two will become clear later, but the spoiler alert for that is that pianists use treble and bass clef simultaneously. So anytime we look at music that's written for piano, oftentimes the top part is treble and the bottom part is bass. Speaking of which, what I just said, the treble and bass clef are used at the same time. So treble is often used in the right hand, and it's the top. So the top staff is the right hand. So remember, as you go to the right on the keyboard, your notes get higher. And bass clef for the left hand, the bottom, okay? Because as you go to the left on the keyboard, your notes get lower. So low to high, left to right, so to speak. For instance, keyboards, this is lower. As we move to right, we get higher. Your left hand plays over here. Your right hand plays over here. On a staff, pitch ascends from down to up. So this pitch here is higher than this pitch here. And it descends lower. So this pitch here is higher than this pitch here. Notice that we're going down in the lines here. And this is a common thing that we see where we've got two staves, one person plays this, and each of these are different hands. So here's our G in treble clef again, and here's our F in bass clef. If we go G, then space is A, and then the line is B. This is a B flat, because we have our little flat symbol. And if we have this as F is the line, the space below is E, the line below is D, this is D sharp. So these are our pitches. G relates to this G on the piano, for instance. So this G would be played in the right hand here. But notice, music rhythmically, as we looked at last week, for our purposes on a staff, things go left to right. So as we proceed right, we can still be going down, for instance. So these are happening in time. 1, 2, 3, 4, for instance. So this F would be down here. This B flat would be up here. It's higher than the G where we started. And this D sharp would be lower than the F where we were at. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, this is a lot of information all really quickly, but hopefully you're following most of it. So any questions before you move on to, that's just how these systems relate. That's why we can use the piano as kind of a way to recognize and use as like a visual mnemonic, because on the staff, as you can see, things get really abstracted in this way. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. So let's talk about how treble and bass clef are related, because they're not entirely separate. There are some, specifically one key place where they overlap. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Sorry about that. So here's all of the white keys, natural pitches, from C to C in bass and treble. Okay. I want to draw your attention to something. So if this is F, remember in bass clef, we can go down to C. If this is G in treble clef, we can go down to C or up to C. But notice that pitches, that lines and spaces correspond to different pitches since we're dealing with two different clefs. So for instance, oh my goodness gracious, there we go. So notice, for instance, if we look at the bottom space is F, or no, that's a bad example. The middle line, for instance, let's do the middle line. The middle line is B in treble clef because of where things fall. But if we look at the exact same spot in bass clef, it's D. It's an entirely different pitch. So we have to be really careful about this and always have to kind of start from whatever our clef is going. We can't just assume what the lines and the spaces mean, because if we do that, we might get the wrong answer. And the way that treble and bass clef combine is right here. This little note C is a spot where these pitches overlap. We'll talk about this little flat imaginary line here for a second. It has its own special name, but notice that C, the line, the extra line below the staff and the extra line above the staff in treble and bass clef are the same. We call this middle C. It's the point where the two clefs kind of can agree on a pitch. One line below, one line above. Okay. Again, whether or not you can recognize that this is called middle C is not necessarily important as much as just being able to see how all these different pitches they all converge at this one location and then they diverge again. So questions, does that make sense? Okay, again, lots and lots of content today. We basically learned how to read any piece of piano music in like 40 minutes. So feel free to stop me or ask questions in the chat. Okay, so treble clef and bass clef, that's where they converge. Let's talk about some other considerations with pitch. So we know how to look at this now. This down here, we are rhythmic pros at. It's 4/4. There's 4 quarter notes in the measure. It is simple quadruple time. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3, 4. Great. We know what this little line here, we know that it's a bar line. And now we know what the clef is, and we know what these accidentals mean. So basically at this point, we can understand with some time everything in these two measures right now. let's talk about those little lines that we just saw a second ago. So these are called ledger lines. They allow us to continue to use pitches beyond the 5 lines of a staff. Just because the staff ends doesn't mean that we can't have pitches above it. Every instrument, every performer, different situations call for pitches that are above or below the staff. So all we do is we just kind of draw them in. So notice that if we're on a space here, sitting on top, this is a G. We go up to the next line and we just add a little temporary line in the middle. And then this implies a temporary space, and we can keep going and so on and so on and so on and so on. Flute music in particular, flute is a very high instrument. Flute players often live in the ledger lines. There may be 4 or 5 or 6 ledger lines up here, and the flute players know how to play that. Conversely, tubists and string players and a lot of like lower instruments will often live in the lower areas down here. So ledger lines are actually relatively common. It's pretty rare to find music that stays within the staff. So you just apply your counting principles to the exact same way. You just look at where a relative pitch is. So for instance, we have G. You can find that this is also a G, and then count your way up. G, A, B. This is a B. Okay. So ledger lines. This is another one of those things where like it's really simple to describe. It's just learning to recognize them with any degree of fluidity takes some practice, and we'll get some time for that. So accidentals are pretty straightforward when shown on a staff. You'll see a pitch with an accidental to the left of it. This is pretty important. Students often will mistake this. To the left of it, okay? So merely apply that accidental to that pitch. If this is the line, or pardon me, if this is the space that represents the pitch E, by putting an accidental there, we have now lowered that to make it an E flat. Something I also want to point out to you, notice that accidentals are always on the same line or space as whatever note they're modifying. So notice that the fattest part of the B in the flat, that is, the fattest part of the flat symbol is on the same space. Same with the sharp. The empty center of the sharp is on the same space as C, okay? And also here's a natural sign. You can see the natural sign. So they are horizontally configured. You can't just, if you put the flat down here for the E, that doesn't really visually help the performer. So we can put the accidentals on the same line or space as the notes themselves. It gives us a really clean appearance and is easy to read quickly. Let's talk about how the bar line and how accidentals work, because this is not always the most intuitive thing. Accidentals last through the entire measure unless they're neutralized by a natural sign. That's why we have a natural sign. For instance, while this passage doesn't have an E flat here, all of these accidentals, the E flat, the A flat, the B flat, if we had another one of those notes later on, we wouldn't need to add the accidental to show that they've been modified. The performer is taught to assume that the accidental that's placed here will persist all the way until the bar line. However, once we cross that bar line, the accidentals go away. So this here, this note is an E natural, even though this note is an E flat. Notice that here we have an E flat to show that we're now lowering that a half step. And then in order to undo that, we then add a natural sign to make it an E natural again. So hopefully that all makes sense. We will see this a lot. We will see working with the bar line and neutralizing accidentals a lot. Sometimes the composer or the publisher or whoever will add what's called courtesy accidentals, which are just extra information to make things easier. But this is technically 100% notated correctly. There's no need to add anything there. So to summarize all the pitches that we have here, these are the pitches. So we have an E that's been flatted. And we often, this is the thing that confuses students, I think. We often put the flats next because in English, we usually say E flat, A flat, B flat, but we put the accidentals to the left of the music because as we read things left to right, if you put the flat beforehand, it gives the performer time to adjust. So that can be a little bit confusing. Not a huge deal if you flub that a bit, but just so you know that it is a bit of a contradiction. E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat. Notice we were just going up the alphabet here. E, F, G, A, B. We've just started in a weird spot, but we've gotten to the end and then we restarted A again. We skipped back down though. We don't continue going. So now we go down to G, down to a C, but it's been raised, so it's a C sharp. Then we go up to D, up to E. It's an E natural because our bar line canceled out the accidental. We go down to a C natural because our bar line canceled out the accidental. We add it back in with E flat and then delete it with a natural sign. So this is about as complicated as accidentals can kind of get, because you usually don't see this many contradictions and neutralizations all at once, but still, you know, just something to keep in mind. So questions. Again, lots and lots of content very, very quickly today. Okay. And once again, I'll just emphasize that also these slides are always posted to GetchaSpace the day of too. So if you want to reference any of this later, you can feel free to do so. So I'll just reiterate one more time. Pitch may seem just like a lot. There's so much with pitch. We basically talked about how to read any note given a treble or bass clef today. But, you know, practice having a couple anchors, either C or F, or maybe it's all of the G's, recognize where all of the G's are in treble clef. You know, design a system and just take it slow. And by using certain anchor pitches to kind of orient yourself, this will get easier and easier and easier. So musicians learn to be able to just recognize these notes by sight. You know, if you had a violinist or a saxophonist or somebody just play this, they could play this no problem. But if you're just starting off, it's not that intuitive. So that's totally okay. It's kind of like learning a new visual language, so to speak. So feel free to take it slow. And while we covered a lot of material today, you know, this is going to be kind of an evolving process. And tomorrow we're going to kind of take a step back and talk about organizing pitch. So it won't be that bad. Okay. We'll have some more time to reinforce these concepts. So if there's no questions, let's go ahead and do some pitch practice. So let's do both kinds of pitch identification that we've looked at today, which is on the keyboard and then on the staff. So I don't remember how I did this exactly. Go ahead and take 2 minutes. This may seem like a lot of time. It may not seem like a lot of time. In any case, I'm going to take 2 full minutes. Look at all the orange notes. Notice that they all work left to right. And try to figure out all of the pitches on the piano keyboard. For black notes, feel free to try doing both of their names, but you don't have to. Take 2 minutes, write down all the pitches. Let's do just the keyboard portion first. We'll save the staff for a second. So 2 minutes starting now. Okay, let's go ahead and reveal these and talk about them a bit. So here we go. Starting off, we can kind of look at these two kind of as a pair. So if we know that this is F, because it's below the 3, the note below F is E. If we lower E a half step, we get E flat or D sharp. If we go up from F, we go F to G, Up a step, up a half step from G is G sharp. That gives us this middle accidental here, or also called A flat. If we go down from C, which we know is here because it's below the 2, down from C, we get B. You could also think of it as being B is C flat, but for right now, we'll just call it as B. Up a half step from C gives us C sharp or D flat. Okay, so we know where F is from before. F is below the 3. The next letter in the alphabet is G. Well, there we go. That's G. The next letter in the alphabet, we reset and go back to A, and up a half step from A is A sharp. Conversely, you can go downwards from C, which is right here. You can go C to B, and then lowering B a half step gives B flat. So as you can see, there's a bunch of different paths we can get to all of these. Finally, we know where F is. Up a half step from F is F sharp. And we also know where A is because we've already looked at A sharp and A flat. So we can think of it as relative to those two. Or if we go down from C, C, B, A. We don't have the 2 black keys here to help us, but we can infer from context that if there's 3 black keys here, there'll be 2 black keys here. So this could also be seen as C. So questions. How did we do? Did we get through all of them? Just shoot me some sort of quick affirmation in the chat. I'm just kind of curious. How do we do on that? And it's okay if you didn't get through all of them, because that's totally fine.
I'm just going to use my microphone. It's easier than typing.
Sure.
Do musicians prefer calling it a sharp or a flat when they're like describing it, or is it always going to have 2 names of equal like importance? Does that make sense?
It does. That's a great question. Basically, if we're thinking of things in a vacuum, it doesn't matter. However, music is often rarely in a vacuum. If music is ever written with what's called a scale or a key in mind, which we'll learn about scales next tomorrow and keys later on this week, then yes, it definitely matters. So, for instance, if we're working with if we're working with a scale, which we'll talk about again tomorrow, that is built around B flat, you would never want to call it A sharp because that's just a different thing. And this is the thing that gets tricky. The keyboard is describing, as I mentioned at the very beginning, a physical phenomenon, frequency. Frequency is just removed of this. However, when we look at our staff, the differences between A sharp and B flat or C sharp and D flat become really important when we're looking at how it's visually arranged on the staff. So that's why they all kind of have 2 names. Musicians probably don't really prefer. I feel like some are just used more than others because of different types of keys that music is written in, but that's more of a kind of case-by-case situation. Like on the saxophone, for instance, saxophones play a lot of music with sharps in it. So I think of sharps more than I think of flats. But other instruments are the opposite. Flutes, for instance, or trumpets, often thinking sharps or thinking flats. So it kind of depends. But yeah, having both names for each note kind of ready to go is a good idea. And we'll figure out which one to use more specifically starting tomorrow. So yeah, it's a really good question. Other good questions. Okay, let's look at an example now down here. Let's turn our attention to this. We are in bass clef. To remind you, the colon surrounds the line that is F. It is the F clef. So this line here, the second line from the top, all of those are Fs. So for instance, here is an F. So there's just a hint for you. So take 2 minutes, maybe even a skosh more. I'll play it by ear. Take 2 minutes and try to figure out all the pitches for this. Notice the accidentals were applicable. And remember when accidentals carry through the measure or not. Okay, so 2 minutes. Okay, how are we doing? Does anybody need more time? Feel free to type it in the chat or private message me or whatever. It's okay if we do, because this is just a lot all at once. Okay. Great. Let's go ahead and talk about this a bit. Okay, I'm going to talk through some pitches first, and then we'll reveal the answer. So, I already told you that F is here, and we know that because it's bass clef, the colon surrounds the F line. This is F. Oh, okay. This is F. So if we go up from F, we get G, right? If we go backwards from F, we get E. This is an E flat. The flat tells us so. Backwards from E, we get D. Backwards from D, we get C. So this is basically C, D, E, F, G, where the E has been flatted, right? What pitch is this right here? This is kind of a trick question. Okay, I see E, I see E, I see E flat. Yeah, it's an E flat, not an E. Because the flat here carries all the way over to the bar line. So even though the flat isn't added, it's implied. We can still think of this as being E flat. And the reason why E is a literally technically wrong answer is because if we think of our keyboard, an E and an E flat are completely different pitches. So they're not even the same pitch. This is not a C sharp is D flat situation. They're just completely different keys. So if you were to call this E, that actually would be incorrect. Close, but incorrect. Okay. And then we go back to a regular G again. The bar line happens. We've been wiped clean. We can start anew. We saw F already, but now F has been raised to an F sharp. We saw D already, and D is still natural. What pitch is this right here? Yeah, it's an F sharp. Same situation. The F sharp that happens here carries over to here, and it's until a bar line that F will continue. However, because we want an F natural now, we use the natural sign, and that negates the previous sharp sign. So hopefully that makes sense. F sharp, D, F sharp, F natural, and then this is now an F natural again. So everything's working left to right. So if this is a natural, then this is a natural, so to speak. We saw this D already. This D has not been made a D flat, but then the bar line happens, so that doesn't have any issues with us. So here's that answer written out. So how did we do on this? Scale of 1 to 10. You could just put a number in the chat on how comfortable or confident this was. And low numbers are totally fine at this point because a lot of information. Okay. Yeah, that's about what I figured. Okay, good. This is a piece that a lot of you have probably heard before if you don't know what it's called. This recording's a little bit fast, but it's a piece that's been played a ton of times in a ton of different places, a ton of different styles. It's often associated in America with Halloween music. This is In the Hall of the Mountain King it's a ballet Peer Gynt by a Norwegian composer. So this is the beginning of that. And so on. So as you can see, pitch moves quite quickly, but luckily we're not teaching you all to be adequate sight readers and performers in this class. So taking it slowly is fine. Even if it takes us 2 minutes to get through 2 measures, that would take 5 seconds. That's totally fine. So questions before we move on and kind of wrap up. Okay. Just like last Monday, we got through just a ton of stuff today. A lot more terminology, a lot of different symbols. So let's talk about what we're going to do next time, and then I'll kind of give a wrap up for today. So next time, we're going to talk about ways to organize the pitches we've been looking at and can now read into a regular ordering called a scale. So remember, having an understanding of our keyboard, of our flats and our sharps, and also of just half steps and whole steps on the keyboard are going to be quite important for when thinking about how we write out scales. Scales are basically organizing the pitches to give a sense of coherence. So scales give us a means to look at how pitch in a piece is constructed. So most Western music, whether it's pop music or jazz or classical music or what have you, a lot of it is based around scalar, or another word we use for that is called tonal systems, where we have a scale that's like a blueprint that we build the piece on top of. So we'll talk about that next time. We'll talk about the major scale specifically, which is especially common in Western music, but we'll talk about what's called minor scales next week. That will be the topic of next week is minor scales. So for the rest of this week, we'll talk about major scales. So I'm gonna put up, at this point, we've covered all the material for today. I'm gonna open the floor to questions, although before I let you all go, I will say the homework for Wednesday is posted. It is 2 pages long. If you were struggling with any of the material today or want some extra practice, the first page of the homework is everything we did today. So if you would like some practice on what we did today specifically, you can do the entire first page of the homework assignment and get in some practice if you want to kind of do that as we go. And we'll cover the rest of the homework assignment by tomorrow's lecture. So if you want some more practice, some more immediate practice, the first page of the homework right now would be a great place to go. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and release you all. So thank you so much for being here. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to stick around. Once again, I had to cancel office hours today, so I am sorry about that. Just shoot me an email. We can set up an appointment later on this week if you want some one-on-one time to talk through some stuff. So thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.